Hey guys, it's Gary. I'm back again with unfortunately probably another long one. This will be under an hour, I'm sure. I don't have a lot of artists that probably are left that I'm going to do that are going to be epic things because I don't necessarily have huge career overviews of a lot of the artists that I'm probably going to talk about in the future. I probably won't do a Tangerine Dream one, and I would love to see other people's Tangerine Dreams, but videos. But I think it was Jeff Final Spin did his hour-long one, and Carm did one a while back, and between the two of them, they really covered a lot of ground. And I would probably just be regurgitating stuff that they've said. So I probably won't do a Tangerine Dream video as much as I love to see other folks do it. That would be an epic thing anyway. Today I've been threatening to do Bill Connors for quite a while and finally got everything that I was looking for. I did pull a couple vinyls now that I think of it, but I have the CDs to show the covers of. It's just that, pulling some of those vinyls are tough. I keep on going through the same cases over and over again and not finding things. So, where do I start? I actually start before Bill Connors. Most folks heard Bill Connors probably, or a lot of older folks, a lot of folks my age and older, probably first heard Bill Connors as the original guitarist for Chick Corea's Return to Forever. And prior to 1972, Chick Corea was playing mainly acoustic jazz and experimental things with Arc. I think it is Arc and Circle. And playing with guys like Anthony Braxton and Miroslav Vitas and Roy Haynes, and a lot of acoustic and avant-garde jazz. And he kind of made this decision in the early 70s that while he would continue to do that he wanted to also get more popular, play a music that could be kind of appreciated by a wider audience. Not say commercial, but he I guess he made a conscious effort to reach a larger audience. And hence the start of his playing electric piano and forming a group called Return to Forever. This is actually their first album on ECM Records, and actually is my favorite album of theirs, and pretty much one of the few that I would really pull out and listen to. The band back then in '72 was Chick Corea and Stanley Clarke. Chick Corea playing only electric piano on this album. This is pre-synthesizer. But the electric piano is new to him. And Stanley Clarke on electric and acoustic bass. The great late Joe Farrell on flutes and soprano saxophone. Flora Purim on vocals and percussion. And I8i, I always have trouble with his name, Moriaria on drums and percussion. So this was pretty, anybody would look at that lineup and say that's a jazz album, and it really is. But back then, you did have the separate fusion thing going on, which was very electric, and here it's a little electric. You have electric bass in some of the tracks, you have electric piano in all the tracks, but there's no synthesizers, a lot of acoustic percussion. It's very much a jazz album, especially Joe Farrell being there. Very much a jazz album. The lineup stayed intact, and they left ECM Records and went on Polydor Records and recorded their second album, Light as a Feather, which I'm not quite as fond of. I do like it at times. This was reissued a few years ago, I think, as a double CD disc, and a lot of extra material. And I'm not sure what that extra material is. Potentially, I think it may be live performances by this group. And again, the group was the same here. It was stable. It was Joe Farrell, I8i, Flora Purim, and Stanley Clarke and Chick Corea. Similar to the first album, not as well recorded. The material doesn't move me. Well, one of the reasons it doesn't move me as much is it's got 500 Miles High and Spain, which are two of Chick Corea's extremely well-known tunes, and he's recorded them so much over the years that it's a bit overplayed for me. So that's part of what ruins kind of the album, and it's not as well recorded as the first ECM album. But it's still very jazz-like. And I think Chick realized that, because all of a sudden with the third album, he decided a change was a need, and actually lost Flora and Aerto, and went with just a drummer, no additional percussionist, and decided to turn it into a quartet, and lost Joe Farrell, and didn't replace him with a saxophone player, replaced him with Bill Connors, the guitarist, electric guitar specifically, and very raunchy, very loud, very energetic, not only the guitar but the music. And I don't think there's any, if much, acoustic bass on here at all. So they went from a 5-piece, very jazz-oriented, down to a 4-piece, with just 2 original members now. So Lenny White was on this, although the first drummer was Steve Gadd. And Steve didn't stick around long enough, for whatever reason, to record the studio album, but did play live gigs with the band. And this was a big change in direction, even from the first 2 albums. This was very Mahavishnu orchestra in its loudest. You know what? Even from the moment I bought this, I find it hard to listen to. But of course, I didn't come to this in order. I had caught Bill Connors when he was in his acoustic phase. So this was a little hard for me. But Bill Connors predated Al Di Meola and only stuck around for the 1 album. Very loud, 42, 43 minutes, whatever it is. Really hard for me to listen to and get through the whole thing, though, because it's basically just to the wall pretty much all the time, and just loud and aggressive and nasty. And Bill Connors himself said he was quite a Chick Corea fan when he joined the band, but he really wanted to play more jazz, and Chick was going in this rock direction. And apparently Chick wanted to go even more in a rock direction, and Bill wanted to do acoustic jazz and more of the things that Chick Corea had done prior to forming Return to Forever. There's a bit of clashes too, because with Chick being a Scientologist, Bill was having some problems with that apparently as well. Some funky rules about how they could perform and things like that. And Bill kind of bowed out after a while. And many years later, however, there was this compilation. I want to say this came out in the early 2000s, compilation CD. I wouldn't have bought this, to be honest with you, but there was 30 minutes of live material with Bill Connors on it that was previously unreleased, which is why I bought this double disc set. And it only has material from 4 or 5 albums. It doesn't have any material from the first ECM album, which to me is the best Return to Forever album. Has material from the second album with Joe Farrell, some material from the third album with Bill Connors, and 30 minutes of live material with Bill Connors, which is why I bought it, as well as a sampling of the other 2 or 3 albums that they did with Al Di Meola after that part. The material is, again, it's that kind of all to the wall, heavy, loud stuff, recorded live, actually from a radio broadcast. Pretty good quality, and that had, I'm pretty sure, Steve Gadd on drums prior to Lenny White joining. So he did finally make his appearance on a Return to Forever album, even if it was just exclusively in live stuff. Interesting to hear, though, but again, it's not, it's 30 minutes. It's tough for me to get through, to be honest with you. After Bill left Return to Forever, Stanley Clarke made his second solo album. And this was a very popular album. This is one of those crossover albums that rock guys that were really into rock seriously, maybe like into progressive rock and stuff like that, would kind of occasionally tiptoe into the jazz world, and they might buy a Return to Forever album, certainly in the Bill Connors or Al Di Meola era. And this is one of the albums that I seem to recall being popular enough that this would be in the collection of essentially rock dudes, who didn't have a whole lot of jazz. The reason I'm showing this 1974 album, By the way, that was 73 when Connors was in Return to Forever. And he stayed for about, I believe, about a year. In 74, though, when during a break from Return to Forever, Stanley Clarke's continuing his solo career with his second solo album, he thought enough about Bill's playing to invite Bill to come down and play on this solo album. And Bill does play electric on here. He does play a little bit of acoustic, too. And I gave this one a spin because I knew I was doing my Bill Connors video, and I listened to it. I have this on CD as well. And of all of the early fusion stuff that Bill plays on the third Return to Forever album and that the compilation album that has the 30 minutes of material, this one I could kind of take. Listening to the whole album, it has a lot of the fusiony stuff like Return to Forever did, but not quite as extreme. It's a little more bass riff oriented like you would expect, but there's also more dynamics and there's more quiet moments. And there's a really lovely piece on here called Spanish Phases for Strings and Bass. And I'm not sure, there might be a little acoustic guitar on there, but it's a really nice change of pace. Beautiful, mostly acoustic piece that Stanley does, and he plays upright on this as well. The first side of the album is pretty much all fusion stuff. The second side has that Spanish Phases for String and Bass, which is really a nice piece. And something called Life Suite, which is a 4-part suite that does include some of the fusion stuff, but it's not wild and crazy, and also contains more subtle stuff. So for me, the second side of this album is really, really nice. Really nice, and certainly worth visiting. And strangely enough, I actually played Lopsy Lou, the song by Stanley Clarke there, in a jam session before I ever heard it. I was jamming one time with this keyboard player who had this album, and he tried to teach the other three guys the basic riff for Lopsy Lou so we could jam along to it. Pretty simple riff, but none of us had ever heard the song before. And it was only many years later that I actually got the album and actually heard how it should have been done. But this, I could... It's only 40 minutes, and like I said, it gives you a break from that crazy fusion stuff, and you do get to hear Bill play. He doesn't get a lot of wild solos in. He gets a couple electric guitar solos. You hear some nice... a little bit of acoustic playing of his, and it's not a bad album. I mean, I've got a bunch of Stanley Clarke albums, and I really never play them. And after listening to this one again, it's like, yeah, I could see myself playing that one. Certainly more so than the Return to Forever stuff, if you want to hear Bill in that context. So I like that one. I wouldn't rush out and tell anybody to buy it as far as a Bill Connors experience goes so much. But anyway, so right at that same time, we're into 1974 now. It's only about a year after he left Return to Forever. We get Bill's first solo album called Theme to the Guardian on ECM Records, recorded November 1974. Now, the way that I read an interview with Bill, it sounded like Bill had the solo deal with ECM, and it was Bill that made the decision almost at the last minute that he wouldn't play electric on this, that he would play only acoustic. Bill fell in love. Bill was always liked the mainstream jazz stuff with the clean guitar sound, as well as some of the early rock stuff like Eric Clapton and stuff, things like that. But he came across, I want to say it was Julian Beam, the classical guitarist. I'm pretty sure it was him, but I know Bill said he'd come across this classical guitar album and fell in love with a couple pieces on it, and then fell in love with the whole sound of the classical guitar and decided that he really wanted to study it. And after having that experience with playing tours with Return to Forever, where it was just getting louder, 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 it really was like a whole nother world to him, and one that he wanted to occupy. So he had gotten this offer to do a solo album for ECM, and I don't think there was any predetermination of what should be on the album or what type of material it would be, whether it would be a band or a solo project, because if you know ECM, they're very open-ended. They give the artist total freedom. But it sounded like at the time when the offer was made that there's maybe the expectation that Bill would be playing electric guitar on it. Because Bill said, I kind of decided at the last minute I was just going to do this all acoustic. I'm just going to bring acoustic guitars and classical guitars, and that's it. So, in November 74, he goes in and records an album of all originals. There's one song written by Glenn Cronkite on here, something called Sea Song, but everything else are originals, and it's mostly classical guitar. There's some acoustic guitar on here, but it's mostly classical nylon string stuff. And strangely enough, I love this cover. It's not it's a typical ECM production in some ways. It's recorded in the Oslo studio with the engineer that they normally use, but for some reason the sound quality isn't quite what I would anticipate on an ECM record. I don't know why. It sounds a little thin to me. Not enough. Probably thin only if you're used to the quality of the ECM stuff. If you compare it to other labels, it sounds fine. And there's nothing wrong with it in particular, but the sound isn't as full and rich as what I normally hear on ECM. It's a good album, though. It's a good album. So, this was entering pretty much starting with 1973 when he started playing with Return to Forever. Even though he left that band, it was an incredible busy period for him. He played with Stanley Clarke on Stanley's second solo album. He recorded his first solo album for ECM, and somehow, and I don't know how, he hooks up with, and I have these on vinyl, but I can't find them, Paul Bly. Now, Paul Bly was in New York at the time, started his own record label called Improvising Artists, and basically Paul Bly was, all the improvising artists, almost all of them have, not all of them, a lot of them have Paul Bly playing piano on them. And it seemed to be totally Paul Bly running it and just picking musicians that he liked and asking them, hey, you want to record for me, kind of thing. And it only lasted a few years. I think Paul Bly was still, he was still obviously recording albums on his own and touring on his own. And I think it became too much him running a label as well. And it's sad, most of these things are out of print now. They were out on album originally, and early in the CD era, they came out on CD for a very short time and seemed to then go out of print. And I hope they come back again so people can grab them. But as far as Bill goes, this is I looked up all these dates before and now I can't find them. 1976 this came out. I want to say it was probably recorded in 75. See, they have all the recording information except for the date on here. But so because the ECM contracts were never exclusive contracts, actually, Bill's already recording for ECM. 74 comes out the theme to the Guardian album, his first solo album. But then he hooks up with Paul Bly and Jimmy Guthrie, the horn player, and they record this. And the two albums that Bill did in a trio context for Improvising Artists for Paul Bly label are pretty out there stuff. It's pretty avant-garde stuff. It's not accessible, even though both Paul Bly and Jimmy Guthrie essentially, kind of come from a more conservative, traditional background. But so they have Quiet. This one is called Quiet Song, and there's a track on here. Let me see. There's one track that's written by Bill Connors. Most of the others are written by Paul Bly, and Jimmy Guthrie gets a track or two in too. And here we go. I actually found the recording information. This one was recorded November 14, 1974, so the whole album was recorded in one day. Jimmy Guthrie plays alto, flute, and clarinet. Bill only plays acoustic guitar, and Paul Bly plays acoustic and electric piano on that. Problem with it? It's very avant-garde, and it's not really well recorded. Both of the albums that Bill did with Paul Bly, unfortunately, they're kind of poorly recorded. It sounds essentially like somebody, they had a recording room and somebody just stuck a couple microphones at each end of the recording room and it picked up whatever. There's no depth to any of the instruments, which is sad, especially when you're dealing with avant-garde music and there's no drums. So you like to get all the nuances of the largely acoustic instruments here. But it's an interesting trio of people: Paul Bly, acoustic electric pianos, Jimmy Guthrie on the horns, and Bill Connors on guitars, acoustic guitars. Bill did one more album with Paul Bly, recorded June 1977, the month that I graduated high school, as a matter of fact. For improvising artists, with this time with Lee Konitz, not Jimmy Guthrie. So it's got Paul Bly, who again is playing the electric and the acoustic piano, Lee Konitz playing the horn on alto and soprano saxophone, again no drums, and Bill Connors is actually, oddly enough, picked up the electric guitar again, minimally. He's playing acoustic primarily on here, a little bit of electric, and that was recorded June 11th, 1977, for Paul Bly's Improvising Artists. And I don't know why, it's such a simple, looks like a 60-ish cover. It is from the 70s, but it very much looks like a 1960s style cover. And I have this on vinyl, and I really wanted to show the vinyl. It's exactly the same. It just, it looks better on the bigger vinyl. It's such a 60s design. It's very, very, very hip and 60s looking, even though it's from the late 70s. Again, not recorded great. Another example of them sounds like they're sticking microphones in a room that's just kind of picking up whatever. And again, since there's no drums, you really do want, you've got a horn player, you've got primarily acoustic guitar, acoustic piano, and some electric piano, but you really want to pick up the nuances. And it was recorded at Electric Lady Studios in New York City, the very famous Jimi Hendrix studio. But it just doesn't sound great, And even the engineer, David Baker, is a really great engineer. I heard him do things like in '81, I can recall. That sounded absolutely fantastic. So I don't really quite understand why it doesn't really work here. Actually, of the 6 tracks, Bill's listed as playing electric on 3 of them. It's a very clean sound he uses, but for the most part, I have to say, and by the way, Bill gets 2 writing credits on this one out of the 6 songs. It's a lot of improvised stuff, and again, it's pretty avant-garde. And both of these are incredibly short discs that run under 40 minutes. I'll get my fingers together. They could fit both of these albums on one CD if they ever got the idea to reissue them. And they're thinking, well, the sales might not be there, so make it a deal for people. Put them both on one CD. What can I tell you? They'll fit. 35 minutes or so per CD. But I am glad I picked those up. But they're avant-garde, and oddly enough, I never forget this. I used to, I was unemployed back in like 1982 or so, and there's a classical music station, an NPR station in New York called WNYC in New York City. They used to have an overnight classical music program, and they played things that were suited to the late evenings. And the show used to start at midnight, and it used to run until, I think the news came on at 6 in the morning. And they played, some standard orchestral classical music, but they could play the whole thing. It was a 30-minute piece or 45-minute piece or whatever. They're non-commercial, so they could play it. But they also played avant-garde stuff. And I heard some of the oddest things, which is why I love this program. I heard some of the early Princeton electronic music from the 1950s and early 60s on this overnight program, even though it was technically a classical show. And I heard music from one of these discs. I think it was this one. I think it was Quiet Song, because I can hear the guy announcing it, Quiet Song. And he actually played, this is in the vinyl days, actually played one side of the album, which was under 20 minutes, and then took a break and actually played the other side of the album, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was really out there avant-garde stuff. And I actually had that radio broadcast on cassette for years, because sometimes I would just randomly put the cassette in because they played such incredible stuff on this show that I ended up buying a lot of recordings based on what I heard at night. Even now, even just in my memories, I can recall that show mentioning the names of some pieces that I don't recall anything about the music, but I remember being impressed by. And I bought this one called Music from Ancient Greece. I must have heard them play this in 1982, never forgot it, had very little recollection of what the music sounded like, but just remembered being floored by this music piping out at 3 in the morning, and I'm staring out my window. And I bought the album 25 years later or something like that, the Music from Ancient Greece. So it was a bit of the same experience with a quiet song. I picked it up. But very avant-garde stuff. I honestly don't think a lot of people would like it, to be completely honest with you. It's pretty out there, and it's not, unfortunately, well recorded. But Bill's career was in full bloom at that point. So we're still in 1977. And December of 1977, he gets an invitation from Jan Garbarek, the saxophone player, to join his band. So, Bill played on 2 Jan Garbarek albums. This one was recorded in 1977. It's called Places. Another beautiful ECM album cover. And a nice band, too. It's got Jan Garbarek on saxophones, Bill Connors on guitar. He only plays acoustic on here. John Taylor on organ and piano. Is the first place where John Taylor ever played an organ, at least on record. And I believe there was one in the studio, and I think it was Jan Garbarek's idea to get him to play the organ. Plus, there was no bass player, so with the organ he could use the bass pedals. And Jack DeJohnette on drums, which also, I believe, is the only example of DeJohnette playing with Garbarek that I'm aware of. Interesting quartet, especially without a bass player. Because shortly after this, in the following year, Garbarek would add Eberhard Weber on bass and use Weber all the way until, as his bass player, in all of his incarnations of his group, all the way until Eberhard Weber had his stroke. So this is an interesting, spacious album. Some, weird vibe with the organ in there. John Taylor plays mostly organ, more organ than piano. You got Jack DeJohnette, which is, a fairly energetic dude on drums, doing a pretty good job here. It's pretty atmospheric at times. And Bill just on acoustic guitars. It's slightly odd album, but odd in a good way. I really like it. And in December 77, the same month, probably one session right after the other, Bill records his next solo album for ECM, Of Mist and Melting. As simple as it is, I like that cover. For some reason, when they issued Of Mist and Melting on CD, they changed the cover. I don't know why. But that's Of Mist and Melting on CD. I don't know why they changed the cover. But here's the original cover, recorded the same month as the Jan Garbarek Group album, with some of the same musicians. Jack DeJohnette on drums once again, Bill Connors strictly on acoustic guitars again, and Jan Garbarek on saxophones. The only difference is Gary Peacock comes in on bass, playing upright bass here, and John Taylor, the keyboardist, doesn't play on this. But 3 of the 4 of the same musicians from the prior album. And to be honest, I don't know which one was recorded first. That's hard to say. Also, the same month, Gary Peacock, the bass player on here, recorded his December Poems album, which had a guest shot from Jan Garbarek. So those 3 albums seem to pretty much come right in the same. They probably recorded them in the same week or two. I love that back cover photo as well. And this is all Bill Connors originals. December 77 again, and this is his only group album that he recorded for ECM. The only time that he had this group together that he didn't record solo for ECM. This is an interesting album, and it's very much it's very close to the prior album, to the Jan Garbarek Places album. Not only in terms of instrumentation, but in terms of musical direction. If you like one, you'll probably like the other. And 1 year later, now this isn't necessarily everything that Bill did, this is just everything I have by him. 1 year later exactly, we're into December 1978, and here's the next Jan Garbarek group album. This is one of the best group albums. This is really incredible. It's called Photo With. And it's photo with blue sky, photo with white cloud, photo with wires, photo with windows, and a red roof. Six pieces on here, all composed by Garbrick. And this is one of the few times that Jan Garbrick's group was this big. It was a quintet. The Garbrick group was usually a quartet. But you've got Jan Garbrick on here, Bill Connors, John Taylor comes and is playing piano on this. Jan Christensen, my favorite drummer, I have to say that every time I mention Jan Christensen's name, is playing drums, and Eberhard Weber on bass. So here's the first time that Eberhard Weber was used, and he stayed with him for, 30 years or something like that, to continue to play with him for over 30 years. This is, if somebody was not sure that, this is one of the prettier and easily one of my favorite Jan Garbrick group albums. The thing with Jan Garbrick, which I'll maybe do a video on him, is he gets shrill and he's screechy, and it drives me up the wall, to be honest with you. So why do I have like 50 albums by him? Because I love the bands he assembles, I like his writing, and the fact is, a lot of his writing is so minimal that it's almost, he's almost like giving very basic sketches out to the band, whoever is in his band at the time, and saying, here, you guys do with this whatever you want to. Here's the basic sketch. And so the sound of his band will change a lot depending on who's in it at the time. And this is one of the prettiest. There's only one track of the 6 ones on here where he does like pretty much any screeching at all on the saxophone. And just the playing is at such a high level, with Eberhard Weber on here and John Christensen on drums and John Taylor's piano work, which is impeccable as always. And Bill does play mostly acoustic guitars, but he picks up the electric here again, but still uses a very clean sound. For the most part, there's none of that distortion and rock stuff that was in his Return to Forever days. So around 77, 78, not for all, but on some of the recording sessions, because he did it on one of the Paul Bly albums, he does pick up the electric again, but it's very subdued. As a matter of fact, the first few times I listened to this, it didn't dawn on me, really, that there was electric and acoustic guitar, but it all sounded like the same to me. The only difference is the electric guitar has a little bit more sustain to it, but it's a very clean sound he uses. It's not an overdrive, distorted sound or anything like that. So Bill is kind of maybe jumping back to using the electric a bit more, but the mindset is still the acoustic guitar for him. He's still playing it in an acoustic way. He's just getting a little more sustain out of it. So it's not a shockingly different sound when he switches from one track to the other and from acoustic to electric guitar. Really good album. Unfortunately, that was the last album that he recorded as a member of the Jan Garbrick group. That group always constantly, it's almost every album had at least one membership change on it. Now, the next thing I found from him was from May 78, so that would actually predate by a little bit the last Jan Garbrick group album by about 5 months or so. And it was the last and only other thing that I knew that he did on Paul Bly's label. And this was a live concert recorded in one day. Bill only appears on one track called Spanish Flames, which is a track that Bill wrote. It's almost 9 minutes, and it's a lovely piece. And actually, even though Bill only plays on that one track, this is recorded May 19th, 1978, a concert in San Francisco with Paul Bly's, a lot of the musicians that played for his Improvising Artists label, and this did come out on Improvising Artists. And it's got the whole album is fantastic. It's like 30 minutes long. It's sad that it's so short. There are 2 duets on here with Jimmy Guthrie and Lee Konitz playing together, and they are beautiful. Just horns, just the 2 on horns. One of them's one track has 2 saxophones, and one track has bass, flute, and saxophone. And even though it has nothing to do with Bill Connors, there's such pretty little short pieces. But Bill has one track which is an original. He only plays on one track. Oh, it's actually over 11 minutes on here, almost about 11 and 2 different lengths listed here for the length of the track. One says it's 9 minutes, and the other one says it's 11 and a half. So I'm not sure which one it is. It's a long track with Bill on acoustic. I want to say acoustic. I think it's classical now that I think about it. I think he's playing classical guitar in here, and Jimmy Guthrie on clarinet. It's just a live duet. Jimmy Guthrie playing clarinet, so quite different even than the other two albums that he recorded with Paul Bly for improvising artists, because that was very experimental stuff, and Paul Bly was playing piano on all of those tracks on those prior two albums that Bill played on. So this is the only, even though he's only on one track, like I said, about 11 minutes. Really fantastic track, the Spanish Flames, which was a track that doesn't appear in any other Bill Connors albums. He didn't record that track again. And Jimmy Guthrie playing clarinet on there. It's quite, and you can see the picture in the upper hand corner, apparently, is them playing together. Really pretty. For me, worth the price of the CD, but those two duets, just with Jimmy Guthrie and Lee Konitz, are so pretty on their own. And there's also Paul Bly also plays a couple tracks on his own as well. This is a good album, though. This is nice, and oddly enough, it's a live open air recording, and it sounds better than the two studio recordings. And they're not really doing the avant-garde stuff. It's a lot more low key, a lot more composed music. It's a good album, and I totally came across that by accident. It's called the I8i Festival, which would stand for the Improvising Artists Festival, San Francisco, 1978. Good album. You know what? I'm going to listen to this when I'm done yakking here. So, we are now into 79. A couple months after the last Jan Garbarek group album, the Photo With album, was recorded in December 78. Here we're into February 79. And here, even though it's not a Bill Connors album, it's probably my second favorite Bill Connors album, even though it's not a Bill Connors album. Bill, back on ECM again, is playing in a trio with the vibraphonist Tom Vandergeld. This is Tom's album. Beautiful chamberish trio. I showed this album before because this is one of the sad things that ECM should have released at the very dawn of the CD era. It's so much in their ethos, so much a part of the ECM chamber quality aesthetic sound, that the fact that this never came out on CD, it still blows me away when I think about it. Beautiful trio, no drums, no bass. Tom Vandergeld playing vibraphone, Bill Connors playing only acoustic guitar, and Roger Janata, a really fine horn player, playing flute, soprano saxophone, and oboe. I think I mentioned Roger Janata. The few times I've heard him, reminds me a little bit of a Paul McCandless. If you ever wanted to put together a band that sounded just like Oregon, the band Oregon, but you couldn't get Paul McCandless, this would probably be the first guy that I called. A couple studio photos there. So, February 1979, this odd vibraphone, acoustic guitar, and horn thing. You know, the flute in particular is beautiful on this. Bill is in on this recording at the famous ECM studios, this one in Ludwigsburg, which is where they were, either Oslo or Ludwigsburg is where they pretty much recorded all of the ECM albums at the time, almost all of them, certainly from the 70s. There's one track on here, too, also written by Bill Connors, with the rest written by Tom Vandergeld. And this is the album that turned me on to Tom Vandergeld, turned me on to Roger Janata. I got Roger Janata, now that I think about it, more than a couple discs as a sideman. And if I heard more of him or start listening to him, he could easily become one of my favorite saxophone players, right up there with Charlie Mariano, my favorite saxophone player in the world. Roger Janato's really, he plays nice flute, he plays alto sax, he plays oboe, does everything in the horn field. Beautiful, quiet, not at all avant-garde, very well recorded. Again, one of those albums that if somebody didn't like jazz, but they could appreciate, quieter music, even maybe classical music, they could dig this, I think. It could be background, but it would be a shame, to just say, oh, this is background music. But it could play in the background, but it almost be a shame not to pay attention to it. Fantastic album. And because of the lineup of the instrumentation, this actually is probably like my second favorite Bill Connors album, even though it's not a solo album of his, actually. But it's probably my second favorite thing. I find myself spinning that a lot. My favorite thing I'm going to show to you now. But first, this commercial interruption. Only kidding. August 1979. Bill records, unfortunately, his last album for ECM, Swimming with a Hole in My Body. And this was one of the first ones I actually bought by him. And then I went back to the Chick Corea stuff. Beautifully recorded, beautiful album, nothing avant-garde, totally sus. This is his third album as a leader for ECM. Beautifully recorded, Bill totally on his own, once again, all solo, just playing nylon string and acoustic guitar. More steel string acoustic than nylon string, unlike Theme from the Guardian, Theme to the Guardian, I should say, that was largely classical guitar. But this one is much better recorded than Theme to the Guardian. And, this is just a fantastic album. I wrote a review, I think on Amazon it was, I'm not sure. It just said, this is one that you get lost in. It's 42, 43 minutes, and you just put it on, and there's no piece that jars you out of the musical vibe. Once the music starts, there's 8 pieces on here. But once the music starts, you're pretty much just lost in it all. So there's nothing that leaps out at you as being incredibly different from the track before. In the best way, I mean that. To me, this is his crowning achievement, and I don't know that he'll ever surpass this. And this is really, and it's sad that this is such a good album, because after this he disappeared. It was just like, where's Bill? 79, it's like 1980 came screaming in, and Bill is just gone and disappeared. Now, unfortunately, just in case you're Bill Connors watching the video, this is where you're supposed to shut it off. Everybody else can stay and watch. Because unfortunately, 79 and my favorite album by Bill comes out, and I'm just waiting for more, and there's nothing else coming. And it wasn't until 1985 that Bill records another album as a leader, not for ECM. And of course, being before the internet, the only way to find out about these things is basically to go to record shops and scour through whatever's there. And I see this. And this doesn't look like an ECM album. This doesn't even look like the kind of Bill Connors album like I'm familiar with, like Theme to the Guardian and the Swimming with a Hole in My Body, all those of Mist and Melting, all those albums, and the Improvising Artist albums even. This doesn't look like it's going to be that kind of music. And it's 1985. And then when I turned it over, I'm like, oh wow, I think this is going to suck. It was clear to me that this was going to be a fusion album again. In 1985, man, the 80s were bad for that. I am not a fan of shredders. I hate that stuff. I've listened to all of those guys, and they all came along, and they're kind of like, these shredding guys, I think they want the fusion era of the late 70s to come back, but since it didn't, they kind of put that in an 80s context. So they had these basically what were 4-minute instrumental pop songs of an 80s variety that they would then shred all over. So it was even worse than the 70s stuff, because you've got this horrible 1980s plastic sounding production, and you've got these guys just doing guitar solos that are just meaningless over this stuff, and they were just really awful. And unfortunately, Bill decides he's going to be one of those guys, and I can see why. A lot of people didn't even know that Bill Connors was ever in Return to Forever, that he was Al Di Meola before Al Di Meola was Al Di Meola, and because he had gone into this acoustic world that a lot of people didn't follow, he didn't really get that credit that he deserved. And maybe he started again listening to some of that electric stuff and saying, I'm going to go back and do this. Well, I can't. This is just awful, honestly. If you like the 80s shredding and all the, I don't know, Steve Vai or whoever the hell those guys are, I don't like them and I won't listen to them. But he recorded 3 albums starting in 84, 85. He did one a year. So the next one he did was Double Up, which was the following year. Same thing. It's a trio with all of these are trios with bass guitar and drums. And all the short instrumental fusion things. And 86 or 87. 87 was the last of the 3. Also a trio, the same. one album is pretty much interchangeable with the other. You could put any one of the three on and have no idea which one you're listening to and think it's the other one. And I can't say to anybody buy those, honestly. And yet there's probably a faction of younger people that may have discovered him through that, unfortunately. But after that, oddly enough, after those three albums, again, in 87, Bill drops off the face of the earth. I forgot to look this up because I have this rule. It's not a rule, but I seem to be following it nonetheless with every video I make. There's always something I forget to look up prior to making the video. And this time, it's the date of Bill's last album. Bill, that fusion thing comes out in 87, the last of a trio. All electric guitars, not an acoustic guitar to be heard on there, and it's shredding, and it's distorted guitar. It's really, I don't know. I'll listen to one of they're short albums, so I'll listen to maybe one of them once every 10 years or something. 35 minutes an album possibly. But anyway, again, Bill drops off the face of the earth for years again. And I was kind of hoping ECM might call him up, just like they did with David Torn. David Torn was recording in the mid to late 80s for ECM and left the label and didn't record for them for years. And the last few years, he's been recording for them again. And I'm kind of wishing Manfred Eicher would call up Bill and say, come do something else. In 1995, this is the date I'm not sure of, but I know it's the late 90s. Finally, after more than somewhere around 10 years, Bill came out with his last to-date album, which is now, 15 years, more than 15 years ago, called The Return. I'm happy to report it's not quite a return to form, but it's not the fusion shredding stuff. What that album is, which I don't have, but I've heard clips from it, and I've read people's reviews. Bill is playing electric, but he's playing a clean tone on the electric, and he's playing almost more of a mainstream bebop guitar. He has a band on that album, which is a drummer. I believe there's a percussionist. I could be wrong about the percussionist. I think there's a percussionist. Electric bass, but it's not a rock, popping, kind of aggressive bass like on his fusion albums. It's fairly in a mainstream format, just happens to be electric bass, and an acoustic piano player. And Bill is playing and writing originals on this album called Return that sounds... Some people compared it to Pat Martino, which I thought was a good... Somebody else said Jim Hall, which you could get the vibe if you know either one of those, in terms of the tone and the direction of music, because both Pat Martino and Jim Hall are guys that use mostly a clean tone throughout their entire career, very much steeped in the traditional jazz bebop scales and that way of playing, but have also gotten fairly adventurous with their bands. You could easily see a Jim Hall or a Pat Martino playing with an acoustic piano player, an electric bassist, a drummer, and a percussionist. As a matter of fact, Jim Hall has done even further out things that he recorded with electric keyboards, even in some cases. But that's how they kind of put that Return album for Bill Connors, which strangely enough was the last thing that he's done to date. So I'm hoping there's going to be more from Bill. He seems like he's skewing in the right direction with that Return album. It's more of a mainstream jazz album, which again is different from the ECM stuff, but it's light worlds away from the fusion stuff that he was doing in the 80s. And I kind of hope that he gets another chance to record. I would love, personally, for him to do another solo album with just him and guitars. And if it could be recorded by ECM, all the better. But right now, this is in a career that has a lot of long gaps and layoffs. Since that Return album came out, this has been over 15 years. So it's another long gap for Bill. So I'm hoping that he's going to come back and do something. Even if I don't approve of it, I'd like to see him out there getting some credit that he deserves. But an interesting career, an interesting guy. The 70s were such an incredibly active period. He's recording for 2 different labels. That when you see the amount of material that he started in '73 with Chick Corea, and then playing with Stanley Clarke and doing his solo thing and playing as a sideman on ECM sessions like Tom Vandergeld and Jan Garbarek, and at the same time he's doing the improvising artist with Paul Bly and Jimmy Guthrie, people like that. The '70s was such a busy period that you would think that this is one of those guys that is going to keep on going like that forever. And pretty much once the '80s happened, things came to a grinding halt. Little period of activity, stop again for a whole bunch of years, a little period of activity, which would be the Return album, his last album, and then again grinding to a halt. Sad. So I'd like to see what Bill's doing now. I'd love for him to record more. And that's basically my Bill Connors lesson for the day, guys. And that's it for today. It's 50 minutes. It's long. I know. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure. I'll try to keep them down even shorter than this in the future. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. I hope there's something of value once again in this, and I will be talking to you soon. Bye.